Well, thanks for having me here, first of all, and thanks to the previous two speakers for your commitment about such important matters. I was asked to speak, I was a little unclear about what I was asked to speak on exactly, but I prepared to talk on the societal origin of human rights, and I'm going to connect it to the human sciences because I just heard that that was part of the title. So I'll make that connection, don't worry. In the little blurb that I made advertising the event, I noted that the UN Declaration, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, was first adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1848, largely in response to the atrocities of World War II. Now, according to Wikipedia, that fount of all knowledge and wisdom, it is generally viewed as the preeminent statement of international rights and is often identified as being a culmination of centuries of thinking along both secular and religious lines, end quote. Now, I agree with this statement, but only because it is the only international statement. There is no other international statement, so of course it is the preeminent statement of international rights. It's the first and only between nations, so of course it must be. And I want to suggest there are problems with this, however, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the idea that there is a continuity between secular and religious opinions is a new opinion, and it's entirely problematic. Firstly, three reasons. Firstly, because there is actually no precedent for it. And it invents a history for itself in the typical Whig pattern of reading history, which is it sees ourselves at the end of history looking backwards, the culmination of all progress, looking back down on previously and less enlightened society than ourselves, and we now know better, and we're going to do better. C.S. Lewis calls this chronological snobbery. So the idea that this international declaration is the culmination of previous movements on the non-Christian and the Christian communities is, I think, fictitious. Secondly, it presumes a commonality between the secular and the religious thinkers without actually demonstrating it. There's no demonstration of it, it's pure assertion. And I think there are strong reasons for questioning the commonality, and I'm going to come to those in a minute. Thirdly, because the UN Declaration actually fits with the myth of human progress that was the very basis of the two world wars. And I'm going to read a little passage to you summarizing that. This is from Joseph LeConte's A Hobbit, A Wardrobe in the Great War. And I quote here, I'm going to read a little extended digression here, page 25. He says, the early apostles of the myth of progress believed they had overcome the problems of industrial society. More than that, they imagined that they had solved the riddle of human existence. And he quotes historian Richard Gamble. Progress, visible in every facet of life, and ruling as the governing force behind existence, brought order to a world of change and moral purpose to a universe otherwise disturbingly random and meaningless. End quote. And then further, this faith in progress anchored the soul. And he goes on to write, a generation later, the leaders of England and the rest of Europe assumed that their science, their education, philanthropy, gentility, and religion represented the future of Western civilization. Even war would serve to advance the destiny of humanity. And once again, I quote, and this is a different historian, Roger Osborne, their confident belief in progress and the idea that enlightened self-interest would bring harmony to the whole world was, in retrospect, an illusion. By the end of the 19th century, Britain and Europe were heading not to a better society, but towards the catastrophe of mechanized warfare. And they saw war as something that they would inevitably win because their society was at the pinnacle of human progress. And this was largely because they agreed with the whole eugenics movement. And I'm going to speak briefly about the eugenics movement now, which is a 19th century phenomenon which we connect to one thinker by the name of Francis Galton. Now, Francis Galton was a cousin of Charles Darwin, an accomplished scientist, and Galton coined the word eugenics. The word is a Greek, it's a made-up word, but good birth. He promoted the idea of improving the human race by getting rid of undesirables and multiplying the desirables. We get rid of the undesirables, we multiply the desirables. Now, so this was taking evolution and simply taking control of evolution. And it was the most advanced societies using science and technology to further the natural processes for the most progressive people of which they were the representatives. They were just going to help evolution along its way. It's called social Darwinism by many. Now, evolution is associated, or rather eugenics is associated strongly with Nazi Germany, because of course they put many millions to the death camps, whether they were Jews or the so-called, what did they call them? The feeble-minded, the mentally ill, homosexuals, gypsies. These were all the undesirables that were thought suitable for eugenics. And by eugenics here, it meant extermination. Now, when they did this, they considered them to be less human than they. Now, I say this because, again, the UN Declaration of the Universal Human Rights takes place in 1948. In 1943, C.S. Lewis writes a book that some of you have read with me called The Abolition of Man. And in The Abolition of Man, he defends something that he calls the Tao, which is the moral law, which he says is something that every major religion has always understood. So it's a religious point of view. It's not just in Christianity, it's in Judaism, it's in Islam, it's in Confucianism, Buddhism, etc. And he also defends it in mere Christianity. The first few chapters are devoted to defending natural law. But please note, the reason why Lewis wrote The Abolition of Man is because the educators of his day have totally rejected it. That is the natural law. They say that it's inadmissible. It's not. We've moved beyond it. They don't hold to the view of human nature and human dignity. That is the religious point of view. And so he writes The Abolition of Man as a way of drawing attention to the fact that his contemporaries, whether they're in England or in Germany, or in Canada or in the United States, none of them think that human nature has a natural human dignity and there's such a thing as a moral law that governs all. They've rejected this idea. They have instead called that morality as a subjective thing. It's a matter of private, personal opinion. We merely have religious feelings. We have moral feelings, but these are not objectively verifiable. We don't know them in the same way we know facts. His contemporaries, in other words, follow David Hume's division between facts and values. Facts are objectively knowable, values are subjective and personal, but actually not universally valid. Now that formed the backdrop of Lewis's The Abolition of Man, and it's written 5 years before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now the reason I said that is that the Wikipedia entry has just said that this was the culmination of centuries of Christian and secular thinking. But the UN Declaration has nothing to do, per se, with Christian thinking, is what I'm going to submit to you. I think that natural law does accord with universal human rights, and Christianity does furthermore. And there's a good book on that subject here by a fellow by the name of Samuel Moyn, Christian Human Rights. It's not that I think there are no such thing as human rights. But the UN Declaration is not that declaration of Christian rights. And so we have to beg the question when we're talking about human rights, what do we mean by human and what do we mean by rights? There are competing views of both of them at stake. First of all, the rights. Lewis, speaking of the Tao, talks about the rights that we all understand naturally every time we have a conversation and appeal to fairness. That's not fair, you took my this or that. You say this even as small children. You appeal to a higher standard that you assume the other person understands, and it's inherent in every person. They simply naturally know that they're under a common law, and they appeal to that when they argue. But David Hume, the anti-Christian Enlightenment author of Scotland, says that human values that we customarily call rights are actually just human social agreements that have been codified into law. So it's a social construct. He follows Rousseau on this. Max Weber, the father of modern sociology, saw human rights as a sociological pattern of rule setting that evolved over time. In both instances, Hume and Weber, there is no objective or normative natural law that guides society in its social agreements. In other words, the social agreements can keep on changing, and nothing will stop the change. There is no structure or order to the laws of a society. The society can evolve, and it can keep on evolving, and there's nothing to ground it. By the way, in our day, there are two new theories of human rights called interest theory and will theory. I'll skip over those because I don't even want to get caught in the weeds on this by giving you too many things. I just want to say when we talk about rights, there are multiple understandings of what rights are. And only one is rooted in a human responsibility before God, and that's the Christian one. But that's not in the UN Declaration. There's no reference to God in the UN Declaration. So I think there's a wide variance, and these are irreconcilable, because the one we'll see, because God gives us our humanity and gives us our rights, we can't change them because God gives them. They're bestowed to us. They're not created by us. The other regards human rights as a social construct that we can keep on changing, and there's no end to the change. I don't think these positions are reconcilable. Furthermore, the idea of humanity is different between the two. Now, in the Christian view, God makes mankind in his image. We're image bearers of God, Genesis 1:27. So God created man, in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Male and female, the two together, constitute the image of God. They also do individually, but together they also. So a family is to some degree a pattern of the Imago Dei. Just like the Trinity is both one God in three persons, we would see that humanity is also in Adam and Eve, the human family, something of the Imago Dei is reflected. The family is really not an important part of UN declarations on human rights. It's marginally there, but it's not important to it. And we're going to find that the family gets, as the UN human rights progress, they increasingly move away from the legitimacy of the family. And this is very different from declarations like Magna Carta, the 1689 English Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution, and even our 1982 Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which begins in its preamble said that whereas with the supremacy of God and the rule of law, that's how it begins. It acknowledges that. There is no such acknowledgement in the UN's Declaration of Universal Human Rights. It's not there. Now these documents, the English Bill of Rights, the US Constitution, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, are actually in that understanding that they recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. They are stating there's a limit to the state's ability to create laws. They're accountable. And furthermore, the authorities themselves are under the same law. They're not above the law. They don't make the laws. They have to submit to laws. I'm not talking about the practices. We already heard that they can deviate this in practice, but in terms of their conception. And it is precisely the supremacy of God in relation to mankind and the subordination of the authorities to the common rule of law which gives, as I say, restraint over the nations, which I think was intended by the UN authors. But because they were part of nations that were so devoted to the myth of progress and so devoted to eugenics themselves, they couldn't recognize that the greatest problem in Europe, what led the great powers of the day to fight tooth and nail until they were exhausted and their civilizations were destroyed and demoralized, was that they did not recognize the supremacy of God. And they did not recognize the humanity of the nations they were fighting against. So the Germans thought that the French were inferior Europeans. They thought that the Russians were contemptible and they wanted to massacre them all. The Jews likewise. These were not human beings they were fighting, they were subhumans. It had to do with their view of human nature. Now that view of the Germans that was rooted in eugenics was also held in Canada and the US and the rest of Europe. Now I say Canada and the US, there were eugenics programs, including one authored by Tommy Douglas, the founder of Canadian medical system. He was involved in eugenics. And there were programs of sterilization in Saskatchewan and elsewhere, and they were on the books, and they were all over the place in the 20s and 30s. Whereas the supremacy of God and the common rule of law actually goes back all the way to the inclusion of the Decalogue, that is the laws of Moses, in the Justinian Code of the early 6th century. The Emperor Justinian had a Christian wife, and she gave effectively Christian legislation into the Roman Empire under what was called the Jus Gentium, the law of nations. So that was the first international law. And it wasn't really international law, it was the law of the nations under the Roman aegis. But I said I was going to talk about the human sciences part of this. This view of human nature is something that we create. And the view that society is something that we can legislate into existence is also a new invention. It does not exist before the early 19th century. In the early 19th century, we start to see new fields of human knowledge: sociology, anthropology, psychology, the so-called human sciences. And they do what had never been done before, which is to look at humanity as if it were an object of knowledge, as if it were something that could be mastered as the way in which we mastered nature. And in the process, we started making people. The illustration of it in science fiction is in the novel Frankenstein, where a human life form, or something like a human life form, is created by Victor Frankenstein. But that idea of playing with the human genome or the human body and constructing new and better ones is connected with the whole eugenics movement, and with the idea that we can create a better world by taking control of human nature ourselves. To me, that is connected with the whole human rights movement that the UN actually, in some ways, is strongly associated with. Let me, because I realize we're running out of time, I don't want to overrun. Let me conclude with this thought, and it just came to my attention. This is dated November 19th, 2018. I read here that a UN body seeks to define abortion and assisted suicide as a human right. I'll read just a few extracts. An advanced, unedited version of a general comment on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights by the UN Human Rights Committee wants to define abortion-assisted suicide as a human right. It does so in the case where the life of a pregnant woman is at risk, or when carrying the pregnancy to term could, quote, cause her pain or suffering. Most notably where the pregnancy is the result of rape or incest or is not viable. So now the description of the number of possibilities is, what do we mean by pain and suffering? Like it's a very broad net at that point. Furthermore, they say that abortion should be decriminalized, both for women and the medical providers assisting them, and state parties should, quote, not introduce new barriers and should remove existing barriers that deny access to safe abortion, including barriers caused as a result of the exercise of conscientious objection by individual medical providers. In other words, the right of conscience for doctors should be removed by, and this is a UN declaration. Now, this goes to illustrate what I said at the outset. If we view rights as something that society constructs, and the UN is the supranational body that is providing a better framework for human existence, is bringing it down from on high, then there is no end to the human rights that will be created. So that we have a right now to determine our gender identity and our sexual orientation, and we have the right to abortion in the name of defending life, and the right to assisted suicide, etc. Now we have as a human right the right to kill in the name of defending life. The paradoxes abound, and they never end, and they won't end, because again, you're dealing with a secular mindset which sees no supremacy to God, human laws as a social construct, as opposed to a Christian understanding whereby humanity is a gift from God, and God's laws under which we operate are there for our freedom and our protection. It's a very stark difference, I think. I'm going to conclude with one final quotation from one of my favorite authors. This is Oliver O'Donovan, and he notes that we used to think of having children as begetting. That was the language we used. Nowadays we speak of reproducing. O'Donovan notes that reproducing is the language of mechanical things. And he says this: when we start making human beings, we necessarily stop loving them. That which is made rather than begotten becomes something that we have at our disposal, not someone with whom we can engage in brotherly fellowship.